looksmaxxing, the manosphere. These are terms we've heard time and time again. But a new report suggests that behind them is something bigger, something called the male grievance industry. It's worth millions of dollars, and it all profits from making men feel terrible about themselves.
We've got this really interesting new research that we're going to be getting into and trying to better understand what the manosphere has become, because actually maybe the way we've been talking about it is a little bit out of date.
Kristina Wilfore, thank you so much for joining us. Your report, The Grift Economy, How Young Men Are Being Sold Fake Belonging and Fake Wealth Online, is incredibly interesting. I love that term, male grievance industry, which I feel like connects so much of the stuff we've all heard about, the manosphere, looksmaxxing, but also the kind of male wellness industry and all the stuff that I'm being, sold every day on social media. You're an expert in information warfare and paramilitary groups. So why did you choose to look into this? And are there any parallels between that world and this world?
Absolutely. So much is on the surface. And so we brought really this kind of new research to bear and really to show the commercial incentive system. And we'll get there, but let me just start by saying my journey in this is a little convoluted, but very, very relevant. So, I'm just a small town girl in a lonely world. I mean, I grew up in Montana. I'm from the rural West. And actually very formative because my first experience at age 17 was with political violence when a health clinic was bombed by extremists. And I didn't think that my community of Christian evangelicals at the time and where I was raised was reacting properly. They almost sort of normalized this. And that sent me on now, a 25-year journey in which I look at the conditions in which violence is not only happening, but how do you disrupt it? And so that really took me all around the world. From Montana, many, many moons later, I ended up in Ukraine. And I could see that the way that the Kremlin was experimenting with this anti-gender, gender warfare nonsense. And they were doing it on social media by taking things like real people faking manspreading on a Moscow subway just to see what the digital reaction would be. And this was 2009.
And how does that benefit the Kremlin?
A conversation against the West that exploits Western, let's say, weaknesses around a discourse related to gender is a huge benefit to the Kremlin because it gets us fighting amongst ourselves and it leads to a whole set of additional distortions. So
wow.
If you buy into the idea that Russia is an example of traditional values, then you're not looking close. You're talking about a lot of on average abortions of women. You have, Christians who were in the gulag. There are so many contradictions to that. But finding the sweet spot in the West around these issues and around creating a sense of both grievance and fear and moral decay was the sales pitch for a larger anti-democratic agenda that in your country and ours and everywhere is really hitting the ground in a distorted online media environment that is subsidizing this.
I find it so interesting how you've come to understand and study influence operations and some of the tactics you're describing, and then the fact that you've pivoted to this kind of new online space or evolving online space, what is often called the manosphere, and the parallels that you're drawing. Well, what parallels do you draw, I guess, between the way those worlds operate? It reminds me a lot of conspiracy theory communities I've investigated as well. It feels like actually they all follow a really similar blueprint in terms of like the leaders and the followers and the tactics and the methods and the scamming. How unique or alike are these different worlds?
It turns out they're very unique, and partly why we're putting this information out into the universe is to try to course correct and help a variety of stakeholders understand how deep this is, how far it goes, how it will escalate, and how the incentives are working in the completely different direction. So the last 5-6 years, I've spent a lot of time doing forensics level mapping of exactly what I described. How is it that women leaders are undermined. Why are women attacked? What is this gender discourse? And what I really saw is that it's very manufactured, which is not to say that we as humans aren't having important conversations, as we are, around what's going on between men and women, but how much of that is organized for a particular profit outcome, or in some cases ideology, or in some cases foreign influence. Pick your poison. It works the same way because the commercial infrastructure is built already. So that curiosity and mapping this in a detailed way got me to the men's piece, because it's the other side of the coin. And so that's what we've been really sort of pulling for several years, but in the last 18 months in particular, by tracking some of this conflict economy and how it's set to eat us all, frankly.
One of the topics that you've really got into in this report in terms of exploring this wider social media ecosystem is looksmaxxing. It's something that we have chatted about on Top Comment so many times. And some of the data that you've got is really fascinating on this. 216 influencers drove, 14.6 billion views on looksmaxxing content between 2024 and 2026 across TikTok, Instagram, Facebook. That is such a small number of profiles with such a huge influence. Right?
It seems to indicate that the social media as a whole is quite easily manipulated by small groups.
What did you find, Kristina?
So this, to our knowledge, is the first quantifiable figure around this, because I think that it's dismissed by, anyone under or over 40, let's say, really underestimate some of these, what might seem like, just a TikTok gimmick, is actually a massive movement that's coming to, steal your son's future or manipulate his body, in which is being sold ideas that he'll be accepted by society, that he'll have better outcomes, that he'll get laid more often. I mean, it's sort of ridiculous. And I found when I was talking about it, the ridiculousness of this situation by policymakers is often not understood because they don't understand the scale. And so we thought, let's look at the reach. And we took a very conservative view. Like, we really looked at looksmaxxing itself as a hash, not adjacent, distorted. And from that figure, there's 216 influencers who are responsible for 14.6 billion views, because it was designed to further escalate and carry this distortion to scale. And that's a predatory market that's been developed by the social media companies. So I am not necessarily trying to call out the individuals. They're making a lot of money. Some are being misled. Some have ideology. Some have ideology that's really not beyond, how they can get rich or get laid.
Okay, so previously at the beginning of this episode, we were talking about how kind of conflict through social media could benefit state actors. Now we're talking about how the conflict generated by things like looksmaxxing can benefit a kind of an industry, what you're calling the male grievance industry, right? And I think, like, what I find so interesting about that number, like Marianna said, is social media kind of it's meant to be social media. So when we look at something like looksmaxxing, it has the appearance of something that has naturally kind of come out of culture, out of young people, right? This is, everyone's talking about looksmaxxing. This also reminds me of Andrew Tate as well, because it shows you how easily manipulated these algorithms are, right? Because it was with Andrew Tate, it was just like a few guys in a room who had cracked the algorithm and had managed to like pump out enough content and financially incentivize other clippers to pump out that content, and they made him the most famous person in the world overnight. So it seems like these algorithms are pretty surprisingly easy to manipulate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we focus, I think, too much on some of those personalities. Although I think your deep dive in Tate world has been fundamental to try to pull out whether there's an organic pickup of what he's putting down, or how much is because of the algorithmic structure, because of YouTube basically providing the marketplace. I mean, I think Time Magazine should give, the CEO of Google, Pichai, like influencer of the year. This is a business model that was invented, normalized, and scaled on YouTube. Yet they just say like, oh, it's Kick or Rumble, all these other. We have better standards. Look at us. Well, this is conflict profiteering. And that's sort of my biggest walk away from seeing this in different contexts, that they are providing the essential means in which very little of this would happen organically on its own. And that's why the language in this research is really important, because we have outdated language. I don't use the manosphere because it doesn't mean anything to me anymore. It was very important in the early stages for those who were studying political violent movements and incel culture to be able to understand and talk about red pill and different incentives, because they were in different places for the men who are engaging with that. But now we need to step back and look and come up with new terminology that matches this moment. And the way that grievances are exploited are really selling a very dire future for young men.
You talk about the monetization pipeline: 1, aspirational recruitment; 2, injection of grievance; 3, monetization of trust. Could you explain that pipeline, and maybe could you give an example of that?
Well, I mean, I think the looksmaxxing example is exactly, the right one. If we kind of go back to like, what do we even mean by a grievance, and why is it so much a part of the Tinder, the material that lets this spread? It's a distortion of real pressures. And when I'm analyzing trends around men, I'm listening to what they're saying. And they are wanting to lean into what being a man means in many cases. Strength, loyalty, protection, those are not bad values. Those are being exploited, weaponized, and redirected in order to either sell a product or sell an idea. And so that grievance is what we remapped this entire sector around. So this is economic betrayal grievance. DI took your job. Feminists, have advantages. Dating and relationships, women's standards are impossible to meet. And feminism is teaching women to despise men. You're physically inadequate. Your face, your jaw, your height, your body determines your worth, and you're losing before you start. Therapy is for the weak, emotional suppression, so all of these ideas are dangerous in their own right, but also adjacent to selling products and an idea, an Alpha Bro membership. And so you see the way that this structure has been built that starts innocently. Maybe I'll find a video on my own. So that may have been an individual choice, but the next 10 jawline videos for that same kid was not his choice if the algorithm brought him there. So then if you go to the escalation, basically pipeline would be where you get to the hard maxing. And so you're talking about, I never thought I, as a political scientist and analyst, I would be using these words, but you're talking about things like dick maxing and ball maxing, right? And this is a really dangerous, we can laugh about it. We can think, oh, is this really a trend? But if you look at men and surgeries, you look at the trend lines around the offline impact of this, it is real.
Just on this point about the start of the pipeline and the kind of aspirational recruitment area, Kristina, I think sometimes there's this misconception that people are just scrolling on their feeds and then they're served up like a really hateful video about women or something, and they're like, whoa, love this, and then they end up going deeper down that rabbit hole. Whereas I can imagine that a lot of the content that falls into that bucket is actually really quite normal, right? Like fitness, like what kinds of things are we talking about? Like how kind of almost ordinary can the initial bit of content someone sees be?
Social media is ubiquitous in most of our lives, and especially for young men, and especially for the what we call very online audiences. So those innocent searches are just a fundamental part of life. But it's where do those go? So once some of these young men begin following, whether it's like I'm looking for a gym, and then suddenly you're adjacent to this ridiculous body dysmorphia, or, let's all take collagen. That's where sort of it goes into creating more of a loyalty, a fan base, and the really trust to conversion in order to get to that product, whether that's a course, a membership program, something that is predatory in nature. It's very hard for young men to to stop subscribing to some of these services that are hidden. There's predatory aspects, built within all of this because the platforms provide the means in which to, subsidize, and they make a lot of money on it themselves.
What if the social media companies said, and they might say this, they have said things like this, that, okay, so, if I seek out a video about changing my jaw to make it look more masculine, that's coming from me. You said the next 10 videos are not my choice because the algorithm's feeding to me. What if they said, well, that is just us reflecting your desire and finding content for you in the same way Netflix shows you like 5 more comedy films because you showed you liked a comedy film?
Mm-hmm. But what they show you is still based on the data they collected on you, whether you're giving that data or not. We did a deeper dive into the fight typologies and what it is that they're gaining when they engage, right? So why the inner fights, and this is, I think, where mainstream media misses picking up on, like, oh, apparently far right influencers have this opinion, or they're moving in this, or they're fighting with each other. Oh, they might, weaken their base. And that's not what's happening online. They're all making money, and it's not the saturated audiences at the top of the funnel, the higher, more audience following. It's really the mid-tier creators, like a Clavicular. So when a Clavicular was running around Paris, on live stream, trying to sell himself and his wares, it looked by the response that Paris told him, like, where to go. But if you're looking behind the scenes, no, he made a lot of money because it's also opening up a new audience, and the narrative response in mainstream media being critical of that affects in no way what's going on behind this monetization and building new audiences and finding ways in which to further, lead men astray.
Are there any other fights between influencers that you think are all about monetization?
All of them are. You could take something like the alpha contest. We're going to fight each other. This is meant to, the emotional driver there is anxiety, around status anxiety. That's going to harden, some of your loyal followers. So it sort of will sort that. Then there's the faux conflict, which is just for entertainment. And that's cross-pollinating different audiences. Then there's the cancellation, of people. So this is sort of this injustice narrative. And that's an audience redistribution. So if you look at it from what is the type of conflict that they're creating, right? This is manufactured. Then what's the emotional driver? You'll see the business payout in the result, which is almost like a pyramid scheme in its structure, because it has all the hallmarks of the same kind of sales pitch and conversion of trust to loyalty to product.
Okay, so the other week when Clavicular got choked out by some random person,
which we discussed on Top Comment,
which we discussed on our podcast, and HS TikTokies, said he looked pathetic. Was that fight manufactured? Could that to create followers? Is it artificial, or is it just a byproduct?
There's all sorts of formulas here that, in my judgment of how the ecosystem operates, are ultimately majority manufactured. Wow. It's not to say they don't have spontaneous or organic reactions to things, but their reactions are all in context to the business model that grows them more audiences or followers to distort. So if you could take the party bus incident as the example of that, when there were big influencers in one party van on their way to a club in Miami.
Okay, and Jake Clavicular, Sneeko.
Nick Fuentes, fresh and fit, right? So everybody's right in there. It was the DEI of white supremacy.
Because they were singing Heil Hitler.
Yes. Thank you for saying. I don't want to repeat these. And what the heck is going on, right? The joke's on us, right? So we downloaded that kick stream, to better get a sense of like who benefited. And this is the formula, that essentially the research reveals, is that if you have audience saturation at the top, it is the mid-level creators who benefit from these conflicts and controversies. And then there's another episode, it's like watching reality TV in the form of, influencers. And so their incentive is always to escalate, to get into the share of their audience, to look for more opportunities to go even further. And so that's a prime example. Who knows if they actually believe these things, what their real ideology is, but the sales pitch they've determined around this kind of dangerous rhetoric is beneficial to them irregardless of whether it's a belief or not.
When it comes to these mid-tier creators, because a lot of people listening will have obviously heard of the most well-known creators in this world, people like Andrew Tate or Clavicular or HS TikTok or what have you. But in the report, you actually mentioned some examples. You mentioned Hamza Ahmed, aka Adonis, who's got 2 million subscribers on YouTube. And you also mentioned Austin Wayne, who's got 200,000 TikTok followers. These are people that some listeners might not have heard of. Like, how does this mid-tier creator level work?
Mm-hmm. There are so many personalities that most people have not heard of that are coming to a social media platform near you. What we highlight in the report is only the tip of the iceberg. I don't want to be the PR agent for far-right influencers. And so we use the examples of the personalities and the products and what they're doing just as illustrative of the kinds of massive amount of different figures who are now entering this field. And I think one of the course corrections is that maybe this is a Western phenomenon or this is specific to the US. No, this is globalized. And you can look at the 216 looksmaxxing figures and the individuals there from Turkey to Sri Lanka to Jordan, UK, United States, many, many countries. And so there are many future claviculars and others you've never heard of who are talking to your son and having a lot of influence on the discourse that people will be surprised by, because the real structure of their ability to be seen is through modeling what they see in the influencer economy and wanting to be part of that.
This is all kind of terrifying and worrying. Are there?
Is this podcast ever not?
But we're now at the part of the interview, namely towards the end, where we like to talk about this potential solutions. Is there any way out of this?
Yes, there is. This is the good news. I'm not in the business of, catastrophizing. If so, I would have, quit my job a long time ago with some of what I have seen and experienced. But what I've seen is also our ability to do big things, right? There's bad actors and snake oil salesmen throughout time. And so, you developed law in which to make sure that products didn't have dangerous things that were marketed in different ways, right? So the consumer bucket is really where I want to anchor much of this. I, for example, do not use the term, sexualized deep fakes is too vague. It is a digital forgery, right? It's a forgery. Deep fake almost sort of softens it. Then you're questioning the choice of the individual rather than the distortion of the technology. So there's plenty to do when you look at it as a consumer problem, and then you start to look at the advertising, the revenue structures. You can regulate and have oversight to all of those. Don't believe what the platforms say. We have to have the political will to understand it is ours to resolve. And an individual being smarter about scams isn't going to get us there. It's going to be a policymaker who understands that the exploitation of their constituencies for harm is enough.
I think it's interesting, this reframing of what's happening here, if that's the right way of putting it, as fraudulent activity, as scamming. There's something, I guess, about the interface, the social media and digital interface, which has perhaps tricked people into thinking that that's not what it is. And when you're talking about this idea of fraud, what do we mean here in this world? It's like the courses, right, where they're basically getting people to sign up for stuff, but ultimately can't prove that they're giving them any value for their money whatsoever?
Or is it like dodgy products as well?
Yeah, what does the fraud constitute?
Yeah, all sorts of things. So you've got, the whole educational membership courses and things that are mostly information that's publicly available. But you're really trying to create loyalty that can build trust to conversion. Then you've got, the harder pipeline to medical supplies. This is the peptides, the collagen. This is all the products and even meth, as a way in which to improve your looks. Like it goes pretty far. So what we're trying to do is break down all of those, match it with the grievance, and then look at how they're monetizing so that we can disrupt that somewhere in the system and not leave it up to individuals who would have to otherwise try to figure out this on their own. And it's impossible because of, in some cases, the emotional connection that they have either to the person selling them the product or the idea that they've convinced them of around their grievance.
How much money are people making out of this male grievance industry?
Multi-millions. I mean, this is millions and millions. And often it's not even just the money exchange. They're also promoting cryptocurrency schemes and other things that are about hiding money. There's no way to put an overall monetization figure because the platforms aren't transparent. Like we should require them not only to tell us and show us, but we can see by their profits. Their advertising model is what keeps this going. And if we know that they're not even shutting down even of the fraudulent advertising that's been proven, that this is baked into the system. So let's ask the platforms, how much is it that some of these male grievance figures are monetizing with their support and especially the share?
And so the picture that the report is painting here is a kind of bunch of influencers, some more influential than others, all of whom kind of grafting away, looking to make money from these kinds of courses and products, but also actually from the monetization schemes that exist on the platforms themselves. And then but in some ways they almost feel like the puppets, if that's want of a better word, for like the big social media companies. I don't know, and Matt, you've spent enough time hanging out with these kinds of people. The lives they live don't seem nearly as glamorous and rich and extravagant as the ones they present. And there's that kind of almost quite like sad disconnect.
Yeah, that's what we would call the kind of the guru scam, where you kind of present yourself as wealthy and aspirational to get people to sign up for a course and then that course, $20 a month or whatever, is how you actually become rich. In sum, have I got this right, Kristina? Is it that basically there is a huge amount of money being made from both social media companies and these influencers and these companies off of making men feel terrible about themselves and off of driving a kind of gender-based conflict, a cultural gender war within our society?
Absolutely. That's a perfect way to say it. And the incentives are all to continue to escalate. And I think people have to consider in other parts of the world why this commercial marketplace being foisted on your country is acceptable. We can look clearly at the owners. Their own grievances are often out on display. It's the sales pitch to create essentially now what they've created, which is most powerful companies in the world who are coming to extract whatever they can, from your young men in your lives.